The building at 3701 Cortland Street in Chicago does not remember what it was. The address survives in old directories, in the footnotes of enthusiast histories, in the faded institutional memory of a neighborhood demolished and rebuilt across a century of American urban indifference. What stood there from 1917 to 1931 was the largest motorcycle factory in the world, Ignaz Schwinn's Excelsior Motor Manufacturing and Supply Company, 47,000 square feet on Chicago's northwest side, where the Henderson four-cylinder motorcycle reached its highest expression before being killed by a single sentence from a man who no longer needed it. At its peak in the middle years of the 1920s, the factory employed more than 400 workers on 2 shifts. The machines it produced were priced at $375 to $435 of serious money. When a working man earned $25 a week and they sold steadily to police departments, to long-distance sport riders, to gentlemen tourists who demanded something finer than the mass-market alternatives. In the best years, Henderson and its sister brand Excelsior together shipped something approaching 10,000 machines annually. The Henderson Four was one of 3 motorcycles that mattered in America. The other 2 were Harley-Davidson and Indian. The machine was unlike anything else on 2 wheels. At a time when the industry had standardized on the V-twin, that characteristic potato-potato cadence that American motorcycling has since made into a national mythology, Henderson built inline fours. 4 cylinders in a row, the crankshaft running the length of the frame, creating a motorcycle nearly 5 feet long that idled with a sound more like a large sewing machine than a thumping engine. Smooth, precise, barely perceptible vibration at the handlebars, a deep, layered hum, 4 small cylinders in close sequence blending into something more muted and musical than the discrete bark of the twin. When you opened the throttle, the power came in a long, even surge. Riders described the sensation as gliding. Visually, it was imposing and refined. The long wheelbase gave it a different grammar than its competitors, low and stretched out, the engine dominating the center, 4 exhaust pipes emerging from the right side in matched curves. In the KJ Streamline of 1929, the last and greatest model, the machine had been restyled toward aerodynamic suggestion. Rounded tank, swept fenders. The speedometer fitted into the top of the tank so the rider could glance down and read 60, 70, or on the right road a genuine 100 miles per hour. In polished black lacquer with nickel brightwork, it was one of the most beautiful machines the American industry ever produced. Then, the Depression. The collapse of overseas markets when the British Commonwealth raised tariffs overnight. The withdrawal of institutional buyers as municipalities cut budgets. The departure of the founding engineer, dead before he could replace what he had built. The simple arithmetic of a man in Chicago deciding that bicycles were safer than motorcycles when the economy was falling. The progressive thinning of the line until the summer of 1931, when the department heads of Excelsior Henderson gathered and heard 5 words that ended 19 years of making the finest motorcycles in America. Gentlemen, today we stop. This is a story about how precision became irrelevance, about how the quality that justified the premium price also made the machine too expensive to survive an economic catastrophe. Not one failure. A long intersection of excellences that became, at exactly the wrong moment, fatal constraints. 2 boys who wanted different things. William G. Henderson was born in Cleveland, Ohio, on the 29th of November, 1882. His father, George Henderson, had become vice president of the Winton Motor Carriage Company in Cleveland, one of the more serious early Ohio attempts at automobiles before the industry consolidated in Michigan. The Winton connection gave the family an inside view of mechanical culture in its earliest industrial adolescence. William went to work there as a designer and draftsman in 1899. At 17, engines interested him the way certain mechanical problems interest certain young men, not as commercial propositions, but as puzzles. He drew well. He understood tolerances. He had the spatial intelligence that good designers require, the ability to hold a three-dimensional object in the mind and rotate it, to see the stress points and the elegance simultaneously. His brother Thomas, 4 years older and more conventionally commercial, had risen through Winton as a sales manager skilled with customers, comfortable with industrial finance. Where William saw an engine and thought about what it could be made to do, Tom saw an engine and thought about who would buy it and at what price. The Motorcycle Hall of Fame, inducting them both in 1998, described them simply: William had the ideas and the enthusiasm. Tom had the better financial acumen. What troubled William Henderson about existing motorcycles was their engines. The V-twin and the single-cylinder both delivered power in pulses, explosions, separated by intervals of mechanical coasting, vibration running up through the handlebars and exhausting the rider over long distances. What Henderson understood from years at Winton watching automobile engines develop was that multiple cylinders firing in close sequence produced something qualitatively different, not just more power, smoothness. The elimination of the interval between power strokes. He began work on a prototype sometime in 1910 in the family shop. With money, his father advanced him. Despite, according to the AMA Hall of Fame account, George Henderson's conviction that there was no future in motorcycles. 4 inline cylinders cast in iron, mounted so the crankshaft ran parallel to the wheelbase. It was a long machine, a 65-inch wheelbase, more than 5 feet from axle to axle, looking to eyes accustomed to the shorter V-twin machines of the day like something from another tradition entirely, which it was. Thomas Henderson, seeing the prototype, understood its commercial potential. He joined the venture. In October 1911, the Henderson Motorcycle Company was formally established at 268 Jefferson Avenue in Detroit. The announcement was specific: 25 machines ready for sale from the 1st of January 1912 at $325 each. Engine, 57 cubic inches, 4 cylinders, 7 horsepower. The ground it grew from. To understand what the Henderson brothers built, you have to understand Detroit in 1911. Not the Detroit of the River Rouge, but the Detroit becoming at a Great Lakes industrial port straining toward something larger. The city had 466,000 people in 1910 and nearly 1 million by 1920. That doubling happened because of the automobile, and the automobile happened because Ford's insistence on mass production had created a supplier ecosystem: machine shops, stamping plants, foundries, pattern makers, tool and die men, electrical specialists available in that density nowhere else in America. The Henderson brothers had grown up inside this ecosystem. Their father's position at Winton had given them access to its human networks: engineers who moved between companies, suppliers who sold to multiple manufacturers, capital sources that understood the industry's dynamics. The initial capitalization of the Henderson Motorcycle Company was $175,000, secured through family connections. It was enough for a beginning. The factory, at 268 Jefferson Avenue, was a working space, utilitarian, organized around assembling precision machinery in limited volume. The Henderson Four required more careful fitting than the mass-market alternatives, more machined surfaces, more precisely toleranced components, more assembly steps than a V-twin. You could not make it quickly. You could not make it cheaply. Every Henderson cost more to build than the retail price could comfortably accommodate. What sustained them was performance demonstrated publicly. In October 1913, Carl Stearns Clancy of New York returned from a trip around the world, the first motorcyclist to circumnavigate the globe, having done it on a 1912 Henderson. In June 1917, Alan Bedell rode from Los Angeles to New York in 7 days, 16 hours, and 15 minutes, destroying the transcontinental record that Irwin Cannonball Baker had set on an Indian 2 years before. These were proof that the inline four's smoothness translated directly into rider endurance on distances that broke other machines. What they could not demonstrate was solvency. By 1917, the company was in severe financial difficulty, materials costs up, labor costs up, supply chains erratic. They needed a buyer, and in November 1917, they found one. The bicycle man buys a motorcycle company. Ignaz Schwinn had not set out to become a motorcycle manufacturer. He had become a bicycle manufacturer so thoroughly that by 1917 he was one of the wealthiest men in the Chicago sporting goods industry. The Schwinn Bicycle Company, founded in 1895, did not need motorcycles, but since 1911 it had owned the Excelsior Motor Manufacturing and Supply Company, which produced V-twin machines competing directly with Harley and Indian from a factory at 3700 Cortland Street. Schwinn ran Excelsior as a serious business, not a hobby. The Henderson acquisition, completed the 17th of November 1917, gave him the four-cylinder machine different in kind from anything in his catalog, with a demonstrated performance reputation and a loyal following among sport riders and police administrators. The terms required the Henderson brothers to remain, William as chief engineer, Tom as general sales manager. Production moved immediately from Detroit to Cortland Street. Before the end of 1917, the machines being built in Detroit were being built in Chicago. William Henderson hated this, not immediately and not publicly, but the dissatisfaction accumulated. Schwinn wanted a motorcycle that police departments would buy in volume, reliable, durable, maintainable. The development his engineers performed on the Henderson, replacing the original inlet over-exhaust engine with a side valve configuration, more reliable but considerably heavier, was, to William Henderson, a betrayal of the machine's essential character. Tom left in early 1919. William followed in 1920, going to Philadelphia to form the Ace Motor Corporation with Max Sladkin of the Haverford Cycle Company, another inline four, lighter and faster. William Henderson, at his most liberated. On the 11th of December 1922, a car coming out of a side street in Philadelphia struck him while he was testing a new Ace model. He was 40 years old. 4 cylinders in a row. Take the machine apart in your mind and reassemble it from first principles. The engine was the beginning and end of everything. 4 cylinders cast in iron, mounted individually on an aluminum crankcase. The crankshaft ran on 3 main bearings in the early configuration, 5 in the 1929 KJ, a refinement that reduced the long crankshaft's tendency to flex under load. The pistons moved in sequence, 2 firing while 2 were on intake and exhaust strokes, creating a mechanical continuity the V-twin could not approximate. The result was that characteristic smoothness, not the violent pulsations of the twin, but a long, even surge that riders described as something qualitatively different from anything else on the road. The 1920 Henderson Model K, the first major redesign under Schwinn's ownership, defining the brand's character for 9 years, displaced 1,301 cubic centimeters, 79.4 cubic inches, producing 18 horsepower. The pressure lubrication system circulated oil under pump pressure, rather than relying on splash or gravity, addressing cold weather starting and internal wear more effectively than most competitors. The weight was approximately 430 pounds, ready to ride 40 to 60 pounds heavier than comparable Harleys and Indians. At highway speeds, the mass added stability. In town, it was felt. What riders remember most, in the collector recollections that survive, is not the speed. It is the ride. Dick Winger, a Wisconsin collector who spent years locating Henderson parts before assembling a 1915 Model D, described starting the engine after a complete restoration as a moment of recognition rather than surprise. The vibration was so much less than expected, he said, that it took a moment to understand the engine was actually running. You expected a motorcycle to fight you. The Henderson just ran. The KJ Streamline of 1929 was the culmination of everything Henderson had been working toward since 1912. Arthur Constantine, hired from Harley-Davidson in 1928, designed it as a complete reimagining. The 5-bearing crankshaft replaced the 3-bearing unit. The inlet over exhaust valve configuration returned after 9 years of the side valve design. Cylinder finning increased substantially, improving heat rejection. The downdraft carburation improved mixture distribution and throttle response. The styling worked in the idiom of late 1920s, American industrial design, lower and more compact than its predecessors. The speedometer set into the top of the tank. Leading link forks, replacing the older girder type. 40 horsepower at 4,000 revolutions per minute, a top speed the factory claimed would reach 100 miles per hour, confirmed by independent observers. Price at introduction, $435 for the standard KJ, $465 for the KL Special with polished Ricardo cylinder heads. Motorcycle and Bicycle Illustrated called it in its 1929 review the most fully developed motorcycle available to American riders. This was simply accurate. The officers who chose it and the men who built it. The Henderson inhabited a specific American moment. The 1920s were a decade of complicated abundance for the motorcycle industry. The automobile was winning the transportation market decisively. Ford's Model T had solved cheap personal transportation, but this created a secondary market rather than eliminating one. As motorcycles lost the competition for basic transportation, they acquired something more durable: cultural identity. The rider was no longer someone who couldn't afford a car. The rider was someone who chose a motorcycle. Henderson positioned itself at the top without hesitation. The machines were expensive, refined, designed for performance, marketed to a buyer who understood the difference between a motorcycle and a bicycle. The claim, "the finest motorcycle in the world," ran in Motorcycle and Bicycle Illustrated, Motorcyclist, and the bicycling world throughout the 1920s, and was not, in context, an obvious exaggeration. Police departments reinforced this through procurement. By the mid-1920s, Henderson motorcycles served highway patrol units in more than 40 states. Chicago ran Hendersons. So did New York, Los Angeles, and Boston. The Henderson was faster than any car on the road. Its 4-cylinder reliability reduced maintenance costs, and its high-speed stability made pursuit operations safer for officers. These were professional buyers who consistently chose Henderson. The factory culture at Cortland Street was the culture of skilled industrial labor at its most self-conscious. The Henderson line required machinists who could work to tighter tolerances than the V-twin lines demanded. Raymond Kowalski, who worked on the Henderson engine assembly line from 1923 through the 1930 model year. His recollections gathered by Illinois industrial historian Frank Brennan in the late 1970s described it directly. You knew when you had it right. The tolerances were written down, but the feel was what mattered. When the engine went together correctly, it had a particular quality when you turned it over by hand. You could hear the difference. That kind of knowledge lives in hands, not in manuals. Kowalski spent his first 6 months on the Henderson line learning what the engineers at the drawing boards could not teach him. Hendersons were shipped to Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and South America under the export label American X. There are almost as many surviving Hendersons in Europe and Australia today as in the United States. The machine traveled well. It stayed where it arrived. $19.57 a week. The Henderson's true competitor was never Harley-Davidson. It was never Indian. Both occupied the same side of the same cultural divide, competing for the same performance-minded buyer willing to pay for quality. The competition between Henderson and Harley was a rivalry between excellence and excellence, two different answers to the same question about what a serious American motorcycle should be. The force that killed the Henderson was something older, cheaper, and infinitely more powerful. It was Henry Ford. Ford's Model T had been in production since October 1908, and by the early 1920s it had done something no other manufactured object in American history had achieved. It had made personal mechanized transportation affordable to the working class. The 1,921 Model T runabout sold for $345 less than the price of a Henderson motorcycle. By 1924, Ford had driven the runabout's price down to $265. In 1925, it was $260. In 1926, with production at River Rouge running 16 hours a day, a basic Model T cost $290. A new Henderson Model K cost $395. This arithmetic destroyed the motorcycle's original reason for existing. Through the first decade of the century, the motorcycle had been the affordable alternative to the automobile, cheaper to buy, cheaper to maintain, accessible to men who could not reach the price of a car. Indian and Harley-Davidson had been built on that premise. Police departments had adopted motorcycles partly because they cost less than automobiles to purchase and operate. Working families had bought them as genuine transportation. The motorcycle was practical before it was recreational. Ford's manufacturing genius, the moving assembly line, standardized parts, relentless pressure on suppliers to reduce costs, compressed the automobile's price through the 1920s, with a consistency no motorcycle manufacturer could match. By 1924, a family of 4 could own and operate a Model T for less money per mile than a motorcycle and sidecar combination. The economic argument for the motorcycle as primary transportation evaporated. What remained was the cultural argument, the rider who chose 2 wheels over 4 for reasons that were not primarily economic. That cultural argument was real, and it sustained the industry through the 1920s, but it narrowed the market fundamentally. The mass buyer, the farmer, the delivery man, the factory worker who needed reliable transportation went to Ford. What was left for the motorcycle industry was the enthusiast, the sport rider, the police department, the man who specifically wanted a motorcycle. This was a smaller and more affluent market, and it rewarded refinement over economy. It rewarded, in other words, exactly what Henderson made. This is the paradox at the center of Henderson's story. Ford's conquest of the mass transportation market hurt Harley and Indian more immediately because they had been competing for the mass buyer. Henderson had always been too expensive for that buyer. Ford's transformation of the market from mass to enthusiast actually favored Henderson's positioning. The 1920s should have been, and in many ways were, Henderson's decade. What Ford could not be blamed for was the crash of October 1929, and what the Depression did to Henderson was not what it did to the mass market. It did something more targeted. It eliminated the institutional buyer, the police department that could no longer afford fleet renewal, and it eliminated the affluent enthusiast who had savings in banks that were failing. It did not eliminate the cheap transportation buyer, because Ford had already served that buyer so completely that there was no motorcycle market left there to lose. The Depression found Henderson's market and specifically destroyed it. Ford had handed Henderson a refined niche market in the 1920s. The Depression took that market away in 1930 and 1931 without offering anything in its place. The $10 motorcycle had been unbuilt by Ford years before Henderson's last machine rolled off the line. The $400 motorcycle was being unbuilt by unemployment, bank failures, and the specific fear of spending that the Depression installed in every household that still had money. When Schwinn said, "Today we stop," he was acknowledging not a competitive defeat but an economic beheading. The market had not been taken, it had been dissolved. 1929, and the world had ended. The year 1927 was the high water mark, though the people at Cortland Street would not have described it as a peak. They would have described it as momentum. The Henderson Deluxe received its final refinements: machined Ricardo cylinder heads, a strengthened clutch, the tank top instrument cluster combining speedometer, ammeter, an oil pressure gauge in a single fitted panel. Sales were strong. In 1928, Schwinn hired Arthur Constantine from Harley-Davidson. Constantine was 42, with 15 years of motorcycle engineering experience. The result of his redesign was the KJ Streamline, announced in April 1929. The motorcycling press received it as the finest Henderson ever made and possibly the finest motorcycle available anywhere. Order books filled. The 24th of October 1929 did not immediately change this. The stock market crash affected financial markets before it affected police procurement and motorcycle enthusiasts. The KJ production line kept running. The KL Special joined the line for 1,930 and 1,931, priced $30 above the standard KJ with polished cylinder heads and additional horsepower. There was no visible sign of withdrawal. What was happening underneath was an erosion of context. The British Commonwealth's tariffs, raised sharply in the early Depression years, destroyed the overseas markets, absorbing a meaningful fraction of annual production. Municipal governments cut discretionary spending, and motorcycle fleet renewal looked discretionary to budget committees. Ignaz Schwinn, now in his late 60s, was thinking about what would survive, and his sons, who would inherit the business, were prepared to manage bicycles but not the specialized demands of precision motorcycle manufacturing. Gentlemen, today we stop. The summer of 1931 was hot in Chicago in the ordinary way, and the motorcycle business was contracting in the specific way that the Depression contracted things, requiring disposable income from buyers who no longer had it. The Henderson KJ continued to be, by any objective measure, an excellent machine. The order books remained technically full. There were dealers across the country who had sold Hendersons for years and had customers waiting. Ignaz Schwinn called the department heads of Excelsior Motor Manufacturing and Supply Company together for a meeting. He did not precede it with memoranda or organizational foreshadowing. He simply called them in. He believed the Depression had 8 years left in it. He may have been wrong the economy began recovering in 1933, but not wrong about the structural observation that had driven his decision. The motorcycle business required ongoing investment that the Depression made expensive relative to returns. The bicycle business served a market that would survive because bicycles were genuine transportation for people who could no longer afford cars. He told them, in 5 words that every Henderson historian has quoted because no other formulation captures the moment's finality. Gentlemen, today we stop. By September 1931, it was over. The last Henderson KJ rolled off the Cortland Street line. The workers, Kowalski and his colleagues, men who had learned to hear the difference between a correctly assembled engine and one that needed another hour of fitting, were absorbed into the bicycle operation or let go. No public ceremony, no commemorative final run, no acknowledgement in the corporate record that something finished that day which would not be made again. The unsigned memo authorizing the shutdown has never been located. Schwinn's biographers have searched the company archives without finding it. It may have been discarded, misfiled, or never written in a family-owned company. Some decisions are so final that paperwork becomes unnecessary. Schwinn had said, "Today we stop." That was enough. What survived the man who built it? To understand what was lost when Henderson stopped, understand what survived its immediate competitive context. In 1931, the American motorcycle industry consisted effectively of 2 brands, Harley-Davidson and Indian. Both had survived the Depression's first 2 years through scale, institutional relationships, and the cultural gravity of machines on American roads for nearly 3 decades. Both were V-twin manufacturers. Both had watched Henderson's 4-cylinder machines earn lavish press coverage throughout the 1920s. Neither had responded with comparable technical innovation. Henderson was not destroyed by its competitors. It was destroyed by its owner. The KJ Streamline was not being outsold by Harley or Indian on any metric that measured product quality. It was being outsold by the Depression by the simple metric of how many buyers had $435 available in 1931. Harley and Indian were being outsold by the same depression. The difference was that Harley's owners decided to stay in the motorcycle business and Schwinn decided to leave it. The four-cylinder format Henderson pioneered survived only through Indian's purchase of the Ace Motor Corporation in January 1927 and its redesign into the Indian Four, produced until 1942. The Indian Four was not as smooth as the KJ, not as fast. It was lighter, cheaper, and sold reasonably well to buyers who wanted an inline four and could no longer find a Henderson. The format survived. The original did not. The engine found at a swap meet in 2005. What the corporation was willing to destroy, specific people chose to save. The destruction of a producing organization does not end the existence of the objects it made. The objects find people who understand what they are. The Antique Motorcycle Club of America, founded in 1954, has functioned as the primary institutional home for Henderson collectors. The club's annual meet at Wauseon, Ohio, draws restored machines from across the country, and Hendersons are consistently among the most admired exhibits, not because they are rare, which they are, but because the quality of the surviving examples demonstrates so directly what was lost when Schwinn said stop. Dick Winger's 1915 Model D scored 99.25 points by AMCA judges at its first competition appearance in 2009. The highest possible score for a first-time judged machine was the result of years of correspondence with Henderson expert Matt Smith in Oregon to locate missing components. Winger had found the engine at the Hershey swap meet in 2005. 4 years of work produced a motorcycle indistinguishable from the machine that had left Detroit in 1915. His wife Wanda donated it to the Antique Motorcycle Foundation for display at the National Motorcycle Museum in Anamosa, Iowa. The Wheels Through Time Museum in Maggie Valley, North Carolina, holds the only surviving authentic factory-sponsored Henderson racing motorcycle. The 1917 machine prepared for Maldwin Jones's board track record attempt, damaged in a wreck when a misplaced light reduced night visibility. Located by museum founder Dale Wachsler at a swap meet in 1995. Wachsler rode it coast to coast in 1997, recreating Alan Bedell's transcontinental run, finishing without mechanical failure beyond a flat tire. An 80-year-old motorcycle, ridden coast to coast, that was always what the Henderson had been. Current market values reflect both rarity and esteem. A restored KJ Streamline in excellent condition commands $80,000 to $120,000 at auction. The 1917 board track racer at Meckham's Monterey 2021 auction carried an estimate of $85,000 to $100,000. These are not nostalgic prices. They are the prices of objects the market recognizes as irreplaceable. The Excelsior Henderson name was revived once when Dan Hanlon secured the trademark rights in 1993 and established the Excelsior Henderson Motorcycle Company in Belle Plaine, Minnesota. The company built nearly 2,000 Super X motorcycles, V-twin cruisers of 1,386 cubic centimeters between 1,998 and 2,000 before failing. Unable to overcome the financial dynamics of competing against Harley-Davidson's scale and brand loyalty with a newly established name and limited capital, the revival proved two things. The name still carried enough recognition to attract buyers, and recognition alone is not enough. The Barber Vintage Motorsports Museum in Birmingham, Alabama, maintains multiple Henderson models in its collection of more than 1,800 motorcycles. The National Motorcycle Museum in Anamosa, Iowa, displays significant examples, including the restored Winger machine. The factory at 3701 Cortland Street is gone. The address is a light industrial neighborhood rebuilt multiple times since 1931. No marker, no memorial plaque. 143 motorcycles left that building in a single good month in 1928. 400 workers turned iron and aluminum into the finest motorcycle in the world for nearly 15 years. Today, the address is a coordinate in a Google Maps search. The address where the factory was. The physical site is a surface in Chicago. The machines are elsewhere. They are in Birmingham, where the Barber Museum's staff maintains running examples and brings them out to demonstrate what it means when a Henderson starts. They are in Maggie Valley, where the factory racing machine rests in the condition it arrived in after the Transcontinental Recreation Authentic, used, still operational. They are in private garages across the American Midwest, owned by men and women who found them at swap meets and invested years of searching to bring them back to completeness. They are in Europe, in Australia, in New Zealand, where the American export models found permanent homes a century ago and have stayed. There is a specific quality to the collector Henderson experience that people who have had it describe in similar language. You start the engine. The Kickstarter requires a full committed stroke, not the tentative jab that other motorcycles tolerate, and here the 4 cylinders find their sequence, not a roar, not a bark. A layered mechanical hum settling quickly into the even cadence of an engine running exactly as designed. The handlebars are still. You can rest your hands on them without gripping. The machine idles without urging. The motorcycle outlasts the company. The engine is still running. The factory is gone. The pride that became a prison